ton of trash.
Hey bad Goyfs, I'm Drake, aka Racked Out Gamer. Normally I'm the editor on the channel, but today I'm working on a video series designed to teach new players how to play Magic. There are a bunch of different formats to Magic. We're going to talk about the specifics of those formats later. For this video, we're talking about the basics of Magic and what you need to be able to jump in and understand what's happening. If you're looking for anything in the video, there are going to be timestamps in the description below, as well as chapters on the video to make searching through what you're looking for easy. So what is Magic? So if you have no idea what Magic the Gathering is yet, it's a trading card game, or a TCG. In essence, you're going to collect a variety of cards, use them to build a deck, and then play against other people. In the game of Magic the Gathering, you are playing as a spellcaster or a planeswalker, and you're fighting against other planeswalkers. You do this by drawing on the energies of the multiverse, harvesting mana from the land to conjure powerful beings and cast spells. As of right now, there are roughly 27,000 unique Magic cards. And that number is only going to get bigger as more expansions come out, and Wizards of the Coast continues producing more cards. Don't let that number scare you off though, you really don't need to know most of the cards by heart. Once you get the basic terms and understanding of the rules down, the cards generally speaking tell you exactly what they do, and it's just a matter of reading through them. We'll get into the cards in just a second, but first, let's talk about some of the basics. Magic is played with at least 2 players. There's no official rules for a max amount of players allowed, but generally speaking, you're going to see groups, sometimes called pods, of about 4 or 5. Keep in mind that the more players you add, the longer the games are generally going to take, and the more complicated they get as players start interacting with each other. Each player is going to have a deck of cards. The format you're playing is going to determine the rules for building that deck. Each player also has a life total. You start off with a certain amount of points in your life total. The amount that you start with depends on the format that you're playing. Just know that it's not a maximum health, it is just a current health level. If you have a card that lets you gain health and you go over your starting health, that's totally okay. But if you hit 0, you've lost the game and you're out. Each player is going to take their deck of cards and place it in the play area in front of them. From this point on, this deck of cards is going to be referred to as your library. You're also going to have a graveyard. A graveyard is going to be the place where you put creatures that have been destroyed, cards you discard, or any spells that have been used up and can't be used again. Technically, the graveyard is still in play. There are actually a lot of cards that interact with your graveyard to do specific things like bring a creature back or recast a spell. There is one additional section that's similar to the graveyard, but just a little different, and it's called Exile. Generally speaking, if a card's been exiled, it's not even in the game anymore. You can't bring it back with a spell. Alright, so now we have some of the basic terms out of the way. Let's talk about how you start the game. Each player is going to shuffle their deck, then they're going to draw 7 cards from the top of their library. These 7 cards are now called your hand. If you like what's in your hand, you can keep it. If you don't like what's in your hand, you can put it back on your library, reshuffle your library, draw 7 more cards, and then discard one of them. This is called a mulligan. You're allowed to perform as many mulligans as you like, you just need to know that every time you do, you discard 1 additional card. So, this time, I would draw my 7, and then I'd pick one of them to discard. If it's my second mulligan, I have to discard 2. If it's my third, I discard 3. And so on. Players are then going to decide who goes first. I've seen this done a variety of ways. The more common one I've seen in groups is roll a dice and the highest number starts. In most games that are a series, the player who won last time gets to go first. Alright, so now we've talked about how to get started, but before we get into anything else too in-depth, we should probably talk about the most important thing about Magic the Gathering. The cards. Cards in Magic the Gathering are either permanents or non-permanents. That's the first category that we need to understand. A permanent card means it's going to exist in the play area until an effect destroys it, you sacrifice it, or it's destroyed in combat. A non-permanent card is something more like a spell. When you cast it, you are going to use that spell immediately, and then after its effect has taken place, it goes immediately to the graveyard. It doesn't maintain its state of play on the battlefield. After permanents and non-permanents, there are 2 other major categories to understand. There are land cards, and there are spell cards. Land cards are exactly that. They have a land on them. We'll get more into land later when we talk about mana and mana costs, but for now just know that they do not count as spells. Then you have spell cards. A spell card is pretty much anything that's not a land, and the reason this distinction is important is because there are a lot of cards that say things like when a player casts a spell. It's important to know that playing a land won't trigger those effects, but playing a creature will. So now let's talk about how you can read these cards, right? So every card's going to have the card's name here at the top, some kind of associated artwork, a type line that tells you what kind of card it is, along with any relevant subtype that that card has. It'll have an expansion symbol here. This represents what expansion from Magic the Gathering this card was released in. Then there's going to be this text box. This text box is incredibly important for Magic because it's going to explain what the card does. The text in Magic is very specific on purpose. For example, there is a difference between casting a card and playing a card, and there's a difference between drawing a card and putting a card in your hand. Those differences seem minute because they result in a card being in your hand or something like that anyways, but they interact with other cards in specific ways. So pay really close attention to the specific wording in those cards because it can make a big difference. Also in this text box, you'll usually have something here called a flavor text. This is just a fun sentence that usually has some kind of goofy quote or lore building. It's just fun dialogue. It doesn't affect the way the card works in any way, shape, or form. At the bottom here, you're going to have the name of the artist who designed the card and a collector number, which can be used to help organize your cards. Cards will then have their mana cost up at the top. This is an indication to tell you how expensive the card is and what mana resources you have to have available to cast that card. Finally, certain cards, like creatures, are going to have a power and toughness block. This represents how powerful they are when they attack and how much health they have when they block. Let's go ahead and talk about mana. Mana is a resource used in Magic the Gathering, and in fact, it's probably your most important resource to have available. You're going to use mana to cast spells. You're also going to use it to activate abilities for cards that you have. So where do you get mana? Mana will typically come from your land cards. Some creatures, artifacts, and even just spells can produce mana, but your main source of mana will typically come from land cards. There are several different types of mana that you'll need to know to play Magic. There's white, blue, black, red, green, colorless. If you see one of these mana symbols in a card's mana cost, you must use that specific mana to cast it. In the mana cost, you may also see this gray circle with a number. This represents a generic cost and can be paid for with any mana. There may also be a hybrid mana symbol, like this, which can be paid with either of the shown colors. The last example of a mana cost symbol is the Phyrexian mana symbol. This kind of mana can be either paid with the color or by paying 2 life and reducing that from your life total. Here's a couple of examples to help this make sense. This Elvish Mystic card can only be played by spending 1 green mana. This Fulminator Mage has 2 black-red hybrid mana symbols and a 1 generic cost symbol. That means if you want to play this card, you must be able to pay 2 mana in any combination of red or black, meaning 1 red, 1 black, 2 red, 2 black, and then you also have to be able to pay 1 mana of any kind. It can be colorless, blue, green, red, white, it doesn't matter, it just has to be a mana. This card, Mental Misstep, has a blue Phyrexian symbol. If I want to play this card, I can either pay for it by tapping 1 blue mana, or if I don't have that available or don't want to spend that mana, I can lose 2 life from my life total instead. And then finally there's this example. This is a card called Null Elemental Blast. It requires you to spend a colorless mana to cast it. So in this instance, I cannot use a red or a blue mana like I do with the generic cost. I have to use a source of colorless mana. Earlier, I mentioned that your primary source of mana is going to come from land cards. So let's stop and take a closer look at some of those. Land cards are a type of permanent, meaning that once they enter the battlefield, they're going to exist there unless they're destroyed by an effect or an ability. The most common kinds of lands that you're going to find are called basic lands. These lands are associated with a color and can only produce mana of that color. Plains make white, islands blue, swamps black, mountains red, and forests green. There are also non-basic lands, which produce combinations of mana and sometimes have additional effects. Every turn in Magic, by default, every player is allowed to play 1 land from their hand onto the battlefield every turn. Once a land enters the battlefield, unless stated otherwise, they can be used immediately. To use a land to create a mana, you're going to tap it. All that means is you're going to turn the card sideways. This just represents to you and to other players that that land has been used and cannot be used again. Tapping is a mechanic that's going to come up a lot in Magic. Creatures and artifacts also get tapped as a representation that they are no longer usable. Once you tap a land, that means that you've used that land and you now have 1 mana of that type in your mana pool. Your mana pool doesn't physically exist anywhere. It's more of just a representation of how much available mana you have at the moment. Your mana pool resets to 0 every time you end a phase. We're going to get into phases when we talk about how a turn is laid out, but for now just know that you can't save up your mana to cast a big spell. You have to spend the mana you have available. Alright, we've talked about lands, now let's talk about the other category. Spells. This category is by far the most expansive and consists of everything in Magic that's not a land. Generally, these cards will be referred to by their type. There's going to be a video later in the series that details every type of spell. We're not going to do that here. I am, though, going to give you a brief description of the major types that you're going to need to know. We're going to start with sorceries. A sorcery is a non-permanent card, meaning that once you cast it and its effect takes place, it goes to the graveyard immediately. It doesn't stay on the battlefield. There's also a type of card that's similar to a sorcery, but it's called an instant. An instant can be played when it's your turn or on an opponent's turn. Later on, there will be a video about priority. When that comes up, you can get more details about specifically when you can cast instants, but for a general rule of thumb, you can cast them anytime you want. The next card we're going to talk about is an artifact. An artifact is another type of permanent card. There's a handful of artifacts and they all do different things. Some of them can create mana, some can be equipped onto a creature to do things, some have a generic battlefield effect, others are going to basically act as a creature. Next we have enchantments. Enchantments are a type of permanent that will apply an effect to either a specific player, all players, or a specific card. The way that you know which is by reading the text box description. You can also have enchantment creatures. Hybrid creatures, like artifact creatures and enchantment creatures, become important because spells that destroy a target enchantment or artifact can destroy them even though they're also creatures. Next up we have creatures. Creatures are a type of permanent that you can use to directly attack your opponent or to block an attack from your opponent. These cards have a power and toughness associated with them, like I talked about previously. The power is the first number. This represents how hard they hit when they do hit an opponent. The second number is called toughness. You can think of it like their health points. Every time you end a turn, a creature's toughness returns to full. So you don't have to permanently track them, you just have to track them per round. So if I have a creature with a toughness of 5, and he takes 3 damage and the turn ends, he goes back to 5 health. Creatures are usually going to make up one of your main sources of doing damage to an opponent to win the game. Unlike other card games, in Magic, you attack your opponent directly. Your creatures will go straight for your opponent, and it is up to your opponent to decide whether they want to block that incoming damage with the creatures they have available. Keep in mind that creatures also have unique abilities and things like that are listed in their text box. So along with just their power and toughness, keep in mind about what their abilities do because that can affect how they play. The last type of card that we're going to talk about is a unique one called the Planeswalker. This Planeswalker card is going to act almost like an ally player. Instead of having a power and toughness at the bottom right, they have a loyalty counter. That represents their health. You can gain or lose these loyalty counters by using their listed abilities in their text box. Every turn, you can activate one ability listed on the card. Planeswalkers can be attacked directly just like players, and when they take damage, they lose a number of loyalty counters equal to the damage coming at them. If they hit 0 loyalty counters, they die and are sent to the graveyard. Now let's talk about the turn order in Magic. So every turn in Magic is split into 5 phases. I'll list the phases out, and then we're going to dive into each one of them. Beginning phase, pre-combat main phase, combat phase, post-combat main phase, and ending phase. It's important to know that these phases take place even if you do nothing in them. So even if you don't attack this turn, you still have a combat phase. It's important to know that because some abilities trigger during certain phases. Beginning phase. So the first thing you do during your beginning phase is you're going to untap all of your cards. This represents to you and to everybody else that those cards are now once again available for use. Then any effects that cards have that triggered during your upkeep are going to resolve. Then you'll draw a card from your library. Once those 3 things are done, you end your beginning phase and move to the next one, your pre-combat main phase, or first main as it's usually called. This is where you can start actually playing cards that aren't instants. So if you have sorceries, enchantments, creatures, you can start casting them by paying their mana costs. It's also where you can play a land from your hand. Keep in mind that your 2 main phases, your pre and post combat main phases, are the only time that you can play a non-instant card. Both the pre-combat and post-combat work the exact same way. If you play a creature, unless otherwise stated by an ability, it's going to have something called summoning sickness. It needs a full turn before it can start attacking or using its tapped abilities. The easy way to think about it is you just summoned this creature out of nowhere. He has no idea where he is or what's going on, and he needs a minute to gain his bearings. Creatures with summoning sickness can still block incoming attacks, and they can still activate triggered abilities. They just can't activate tap abilities. Once you've got done casting all your spells that you want to, and you're ready to move on, we'll move on to the next phase, combat phase. This is one of the most important phases to play in the proper order, because instant spells or instant abilities can really change the way that combat plays out. There's going to be a video later on discussing how those things work when I talk about priority and the stack, but that's going to come in another video and it's a little out of the scope of the basics here. For now, we're going to look at the general layout of combat. The first step is beginning of combat. If you have a card effect that triggers at the beginning of combat, this is where that happens. The second thing is you declare attackers. If it is your turn, you can declare which one of your creatures are attacking and who they are attacking. Once you have declared your attackers, you can't change your mind, so make sure you proceed with caution here. Third, declare blockers. This is where the player being attacked can decide how they want to block the attackers coming at them, or if they want to block at all. To do that, you declare which one of your creatures is blocking which one of the attacking creatures. You can also have multiple creatures block a single creature, in case you wanted to do that for any abilities or effects that may be relevant. Just like with attackers, once you have declared your blockers, you cannot change your mind. After that, we start resolving damage. The first thing that happens is first strike damage. This step exists because there's creatures with abilities called first strike or double strike. We'll explain those abilities later on in the keywords video that I'm going to make in this series. Just know that that type of damage resolves first here. Afterwards, we go to regular damage occurring. This is where creatures without first strike deal damage, and where creatures with double strike do damage again. Then combat ends. Some abilities trigger at the end of combat, and that's where those take place. Earlier I mentioned that you can block a single creature with multiple creatures. Something important to note is the attacker decides how the damage is split up between the multiple blockers. I can decide to put all of my damage towards one creature to kill it, or I can split that damage between the two. That can be important later for spells or abilities. Just know that that's how that works as of right now. It's a more recent change in how damage is assigned. Once combat is completely over, we move to the post-combat main phase. This works exactly like the pre-combat main phase, and this one is sometimes called your second main. During this, you can start playing spells again. If you haven't played a land yet, you can play one from your hand. If you have a sorcery, enchantment, a creature, anything like that, you can play that now. After your post-combat main phase, we move on to the end phase. The first thing you do during this phase is activate any effects that trigger during your end phase. A lot of steps say at the beginning of your end phase, X, Y, or Z happens. That's where this takes place at. You're also going to look at the cards in your hand and see if you have more cards than your maximum hand size. By default, your maximum hand size is 7. There are some cards that can change this though, so just keep in mind what abilities are in play. So if you have more than your maximum hand size, you have to discard down to your maximum hand size. Then, all creatures' toughness resets back to full. The player ends their turn, and the next player starts the process all over again. Just know that even experienced players have to take a break sometimes and relook up rules, so don't feel overwhelmed. If you're new to Magic and you want to keep learning, keep an eye out for any upcoming videos where I'm going to talk about things like all of the major keywords, the different types of cards, how priority and the stack works. But thank you for sticking around. I'll see you guys next time. Take care.
This is Bad Goyfs signing off. You're all my Goyfs, and I love you.